Hi everybody, I'm Chad Antorno and this is my spring semester project for ECE8498. I'm doing my project on the AWS IoT button. So for the agenda, what I'll be doing is going over the project, what the button is, all of the things that I can do with the button. The requirements we'll go over, all of the things that you need, then you yourself can do the same things that I did. We'll go over all of the security controls and implications of using the AWS IoT button and everything involved in security. We'll talk about some of the lessons learned on this project. I'll provide all of the resources that I used, and then I'll have a link to my demo. I have a longer demo of this, 50 minutes, and it goes over the entire thing, and you can just follow along and watch and copy what I'm doing. So for the project, what I'm doing is configuring an AWS IoT button with Lambda functions. So I'm essentially doing this in three different parts. I have this AWS IoT button right here that you can purchase from Amazon for about $20, and you can have it do certain actions. You can push the button once, twice, or hold it down for about 2 seconds to perform three different actions. So you can have the button do three different things. So what I'm doing is I'm doing a few things here. The first part, I'm manually configuring the AWS IoT button, and then I'll be connecting it into a Lambda function in Amazon's AWS console. And what I'll have it do is send out a test email. And then what I'll do is configure all of the IAM permissions, which is your permissions that you have in AWS, and then creating certificates. And then I'll be connecting the button into if this then that, which is like a orchestration type web tool that you can use to have certain actions be performed. And then what the action we'll be having it do is connect to my Nest thermostat and change the temperature. For the second part, what I'll be doing is modifying the first part a little bit, and I'll have it connect into my AWS account again, but this time I'll have an EC2 instance running, and I'll be able to use the button to stop and start that instance. So it's pretty neat. You can use Lambda functions and the button to perform actions inside of AWS, which is pretty neat. And for that, we'll be using a few tools. We'll be using GitHub and Node.js and Grunt, and then you will be using EC2 instances that we have. And for the third part makes it much easier. Amazon made this much easier. It is even easier after the time when I started working on this project. Now they have an if this then that button on their iOS app that automatically does configurations for you. So you just essentially just click through on your iOS or Android app, and you can do the same things we did in the first part, which is manually going through all the steps and creating a Lambda function. And you can just do that with your phone very easily. And then throughout this, we'll be cleaning everything up because since we're using AWS, there are costs involved, and we don't want to have anything lingering around that may cause an expense for us. So for the requirements, I'll be using the Amazon AWS IoT button, which you can get from Amazon for $20. And I have, this is what their page looks like. You can search for IoT button, and then if you go to Amazon, you can purchase it for $20. I guess it's not in stock right now, so it will be in a few days. So maybe they're coming out with a new one, or maybe there's high demand for this right now. So you can purchase it for $20 from Amazon. We'll be using a web browser to connect into most things. If this then that is a web client that we'll be using. The Amazon Web Console, which I'm showing you right now, is the environment we'll be creating the Lambda functions in and all the IAM roles. So we'll be using this. You can get a free account for 12 months. You just have to put your credit card in, and then you can do everything that I'm doing. I'm not doing anything that requires a cost on the free account, and you can do all of this for free yourself for 12 months and play around with AWS, with the AWS environment. So web browser, like I talked about, for accessing if this then that, and as well as AWS. We'll be creating AWS IAM roles. IAM roles are permissions, right? So you can create permissions, you can create users, you can create access all through IAM. We'll be creating Lambda functions and then EC2 environments. So if you create your own free account, you'll have the permissions required to be able to do all this. If you're using someone else's account, you'll need them to set up IAM permissions to allow you to do Lambda functions, create and start EC2 instances, and then give you a user with certain access to all the things that we just talked about. You'll need access to internet and Wi-Fi. It sounds like a basic requirement, but it's needed because the button, in order to set it up, you'll need to connect this to a Wi-Fi device, and you'll need to know the credentials for that Wi-Fi router modem to be able to connect into it. So you'll just need to know those. And then for the Node.js and Grunt part, as well as the Amazon AWS SDK portion of this project, you'll need to set up an environment. And what I did is I set up a virtual environment that I can just destroy after I'm done. And I'm using CentOS 7, which is a Linux environment. And then for the final part of the project, to do everything much easier, you can get the AWS IoT button dev. If you look that up in the App Store, Android App Store, or iOS App Store. So those are all the requirements that we need. For security, there's a lot of security going on in this project because we're doing so many connections. And we're using lots of functions in AWS, so there's a lot of security that we're doing. For if this then that, you'll need to create an account, and of course you'll have security around that. You'll have a username and password, but then you'll be creating something called a webhook inside if this then that. And once you create a webhook, you'll be given a maker key, and that maker key is tied to your account webhook. So you don't want to share that with anyone, and you want to make sure that is secure. For this project, you'll need if you don't have an S thermostat, I mean, you could do it with other things. So for me, I'm using an S thermostat, and it's tied to my web account. So an S thermostat is a thermostat that is a smart thermostat. You can say it's IoT, right? It's an IoT thermostat. And it sits in my house, and I can control it through a web app or through a smartphone. So you'll need account access into that with username and password. The AWS IoT button has a serial number which is unique to the button. Now that serial number can be shared, but when you get into creating private keys and a certificate for the button, you're passing that over to the IoT button and using that serial number. So you can share the serial number, it's okay. It's a unique serial number, but you never want to share that private key. That private key that we create in this project, you never want to share that with anyone and reveal it. Once you reveal the private key or that maker key that we created earlier, or the secret access key, which we'll talk about, once those are revealed, you have to assume that everyone can see them and you're now compromised. So you never want to share any of those things. The Wi-Fi secret key, right? You need the password for the Wi-Fi. So there's security around your Wi-Fi there. CentOS, you'll need sudoers privileges to be able to perform a lot of these actions that we'll be setting up Node.js and Grunt with. So you're secured around the ID permissions that you have on that Linux account. And then the AWS IAM roles. So you need access to be able to create EC2 instances, Lambda functions, as well as CloudWatch permissions where all the logging will go. And then you need an account. It can be the same account, but that account needs access to be able to use AWS's SDK, Software Development Kit, to perform actions inside of Linux to talk to your AWS console. So for that, you'll have a secret access key, as well as a console password if you need to get into the console with that. So like I said, you want to never share any of this information. And the things that are strictly tied to this button to perform all these actions are that maker key, the private key to connect your console, AWS console, to the button, and then the secret access key that's tied to your IAM role. The rest are more on credential side of accessing, so you need the permissions to access and install. So the lessons learned. First time using if this then that. It's an web orchestration type tool. So for instance, you could leave school, your class gets out, you could leave school, and then your buddy can get a notification saying that you'll be over in 10 minutes because you just left class. You can set it up with Nest, right? So you can have it do certain actions on your Nest. So you can have it orchestrate your life. You can have it do certain things based on what's happening, where you're going, if you pushed a button on a device. So it's pretty neat. And then Lambda functions. So Lambda is really cool. I never use Lambda. They call it serverless. If you ever hear about serverless servers, I think they call it serverless servers. Then that's what you're doing. You're using Lambda. You don't have to build out your servers. The servers are already built, and you don't care what's happening behind the scenes. And so that was pretty neat that I got to use Lambda functions. Essentially, just write up some code, and Lambda is able to figure out what you need, the services that you need, and it's able to spin it up in milliseconds and launch whatever you wanted it to launch. Node.js and Grunt. So I heard Node.js before. It was more of like a web type of tooling. But the way I used it with Grunt. You can have it install Grunt, which is an orchestration tool, and Grunt's able to talk to AWS, push out my Lambda code, and pull in all the dependencies that I need to push out the Lambda code, and it's just able to work with whatever orchestration you need it to work with. And for this instance, I needed to work with AWS, and it was pretty cool. The AWS CLI, so that's the command line interface SDK. That's used for, you can run commands instead of going into the console and using the GUI in the web browser. You can do the same exact thing with the CLI commands, and you can have that data pushed out to a file or to your screen, and you can see it much easier than going into the console and getting that. So that was fun to use because I was able to gather information very quickly with that instead of trying to find it in AWS's console. I use Git. So Git I was pretty new to, though I knew how it worked. I just mainly cloned things. I pulled down the code from people. But for this instance, I pulled down code, I pushed code, I did some forking, and then I also worked with one of the authors of some of the code that I used to try to fix it. And I communicated with him. He modified his code, and then he updated his code, and then I pulled down new code that he had set up and did some more troubleshooting. So that was fun. There was a lot of troubleshooting, like that Git part that I talked with the author of some code. Just learning about Node.js, Grunt, and then the Lambda functions. There's a lot of trial and error, just getting it to work. The button would fail for certain reasons a lot, and I had to look up what was going on with the button. So now I'm a pro because I've done it so many times. But going through all this, it's a lot of troubleshooting, and it was a lot of fun. So yeah, for it, I just had a lot of fun, and it was cool. So for the resources that I used, you can follow along with all of these resources and get all the information that you need to set up your own button with the project that I did. AWS provides some great documentation, developer guides, so you can follow along and set up your function that way. The GitHub that I used, I pulled down some code for the EC2 controller to be able to act with EC2, start and stop it. So there was some issues with the code and going through the setup, and so I reached out to Geek Muse, and he updated his code. He got some of his code. So Tim B made code to allow the button to work with Lambda, and then the Geek Muse created code to allow Lambda to work with the button, the EC2 part of it. So it was pretty neat. So it was a two-parter there, and then I did some forking myself, and I modified my own code without having to touch theirs. So you can even pull it down for me. It's a fork of Geek Muse's. If this then that. So in if this then that, you have tooling allows you to do the orchestration. For the next part, I have an Ansel, which I didn't really talk on. I have this tool called Ansel, and it is a virtual private server that sits at my house. It's very neat. It's essentially AWS, but at my house, and it has this very cool web console. And it just sits. It's very small, about 12 inches, and it sits on my desk, and I can spin up environments and delete the environments. If you've ever used VMware or VirtualBox, it's very similar to that, except I can spin up things immediately, and I don't have to define things. I just tell it what I want and just hit start, and then 10 seconds later I have this very cool server running, and then when I'm done testing, I could just delete it and it's gone. So for the things I do, I use the Ansel, but you can of course use a VM. If you have VirtualBox is free, you can use VirtualBox. I use the AWS IoT button, which I showed you. It is generation 2. There's delays in shipping, so maybe they're coming out with 3, or maybe it's just in high demand. I have my code on Pastebin, so you can check it out right here. And all my code is here, all of the commands that I used to run my code. It's freely available on Pastebin. I have it uploaded. And then I also have the code I used for my Lambda functions. So this code talks about the long pressing, and this code is used for my Lambda. And now the final part, I have my demo, which you can go right here for, and you can watch the long version of my demo. It's on YouTube, and it's 50 minutes, and you can go through the entire thing and watch me do it. For the last part, that's my demo, and I just want to say thank you and enjoy my project. Thanks. Okay.